I will take you along a bit in my research on consumer behavior and the psychology of meat consumption. I already noticed I kind of changed the title of my presentation. And I will take you along in my work and try to show you that consumer behavior is not always irrational, but you can understand it and that it can be used to support more desired choices. As it's online, it's difficult to have interaction with the public, but I often ask a question, so I would like to invite you to at least think along with me. So please think about animals in a way like the pets you have at home, like this pig running through a field, and think about the love you might have for animals. Now, also think about at the same time the love you might have for meat or other animal-based products. And I, on purpose, chose this picture to see the contrast. And I'm also aware that people do not like this contrast, so apologies for that. But it is a very interesting contrast, and what we refer to as the meat paradox. So on the one hand, people can love animals and really appreciate them. And on the other hand, they can also really love the taste of meat and like to barbecue or eat cheese, etc. And these feelings can be present at the same moment, which I think is very interesting and which really shows how complex consumer behavior sometimes is. And I, for example, also pose this question sometimes about intentions and behavior. And that shows also a similar contrast. So on the one hand, people can really like to behave in a more healthy manner or a more sustainable manner. But on the other hand, they see themselves grabbing a birthday cake, eating the crisps on the couch or some cheese, etc. And it can be there at the same time. So that's the intention behavior gap, also showing some conflict there can be. And that's what I'm very intrigued in. And I'm always trying to disentangle these processes and find ways to support more sustainable and healthy choices. So today we're talking about the protein transition and all kinds of sustainable proteins. And I would like to start a bit, and apologies if you already heard a few of these different of these animal-based proteins are extremely high. So in Western countries, we see that there is a lot of consumption of animal-based products. And in this picture, you can see the consumption of meat, and that it's very high in the Western countries, and that's exceeding the nutritional guidelines. And we also see that although we have this knowledge already for decades that these environmental impact is quite large, that the production was like growing and growing over the years, especially due to poultry and pig production. And some numbers of the Netherlands showing that on the moment, if we're talking about our CO2 emissions, that the food and drinks we consume is 21% of our household emissions. And you can think, okay, but we have to eat, we have to drink. But what's calculated is that especially due to the meat consumption. And that's why we are talking about the protein transition. And the protein transition is a transition from very traditional meat and dairy-based proteins towards other more sustainable proteins. For example, insects, but also cultured meat. It can also be plant-based analogs, all these replacements, which are really lookalikes, but more based on plant-based, or sometimes also hybrid products, and more non-processed plant-based proteins. And the transition is not stating that we cannot consume any meat anymore, or we cannot consume dairy anymore. It's meant to state that we shift. so that we consume a bit less animal-based proteins and a bit more plant-based proteins. And there are also different routes to get there. So for example, different consumer groups have different transition paths that fit them. So for example, some people really enjoy the taste of meat and cannot imagine a meal without meat. But for them, it might be a good idea to have smaller portions. So they have their consumption of meat every day, but just smaller portions. Whereas someone else might think, okay, but when I consume meat, it has to be a good plate of meat. And then it can be the portions. And another example is the replacement. Some people really fit to the meat plant-based analogs, whereas for other people, these non-processed plant proteins are already a fitting strategy. So there are different strategies that fit to different consumer groups. We conducted the protein monitor, which really is calculating what's the consumption of proteins within the Netherlands. And what we see is that currently the protein consumption is still showing a higher amount of proteins on animal-based proteins. That's meat, but also dairy and cheese. And although we have like a lot of attention to the protein transition and a lot of is happening, the consumption rates are very stable over the years. So if we compare that across the years, you can see that there's only a slight decrease in the animal-based proteins, and that's still the largest amount of proteins is animal-based within the Netherlands. When we calculate it on group level, I'm not going into detail, but then the ratios are even more towards animal-based proteins, because when the consumer groups that consume animal-based proteins also consume more proteins. So then we see that it's 61% animal-based proteins. Just showing that although we are talking a lot about the protein transition in the Netherlands, still on the moment we see that the consumption of animal-based proteins is higher compared to plant-based proteins. And the ministry set an ambition to go towards 60% of or 50% of 50-50 ratio in 2030. And yeah, if we go like this in the transition, we're not going to make that. So we have to speed up that transition to get there. Some other examples we explored in this monitor, just a bit to give you an idea. So we also explored for different contexts what the ratios are, and then you can see that especially the main meal is the context where people consume a lot of animal-based proteins, and the other contexts like lunch and breakfast and snacks are already a bit more in balance or even leaning towards plant-based. We also, in the protein monitor, had a look at all kinds of drivers that play a role in understanding the acceptance of different proteins. So we included meat and meat analogs and dairy analogs and nuts and seeds and pulses. And we asked a lot of different questions. So we explored the intention, but also the social norms, emotions, attitudes, etc. And what we very clearly saw is that currently these animal-based proteins score higher in the acceptance, and these different drivers which show to be important for the acceptance also lean towards these animal-based proteins, stating that we need to find a good storyline to really progress this protein transition, because it's not going to change itself, as still the standard seems to be the animal-based proteins. And the final example, what we also did, we went to the supermarket, so we also explored what's in the retail available for consumers. And there we also saw that the animal-based proteins receive the most marketing attention, so compared to plant-based proteins. So whether it's the offerings, the price promotions, the recipes, new product introductions, all kinds of different examples, we saw that these animal-based proteins received the most attention in terms of marketing. So again, in total, this protein monitor really shows, okay, on this moment, it's also from the retail perspective, it's the marketing is also highlighting that as the standard. So for today, I want to take you along a bit in my research. So we have now sketched the field. We see that there is something needed to support consumers towards more plant-based proteins, though that currently these animal-based proteins are the standard. So and this is not changing that much over time. So there is something needed to make that change, to support these changes. And these are some examples of models we use. I'm not going into detail into these, but just to give a bit of an idea how we work and how our examples are based in the literature. So on the left side, I think it's also for you, the left side, you can see the motivation, opportunity, and ability, and the circle. This is based on, for example, the MOA model or the behavioral change wheel model. And that's a theory we often use. So the idea behind that is behavior change is only going to happen when three components are in place. And that's the motivation. People need to want to change their behavior. The opportunity, so the environment has to make it possible to change their behavior. And the ability, so consumers also have to be able to perform the behavior. And when one of these components is not in place, then the behavior change is not going to happen. And it also makes sense, right? If someone is really motivated and capable to perform a certain behavior, but it's just not there in the supermarket, then it's not going to happen. And also the other way around, if it's there's lots of plant-based protein products available in the supermarket, people are able and capable to make these recipes, etc., but they're just not motivated to change, nothing is going to happen. So you need these three components to change behavior. And the circle below shows that, which is a nice thing about this behavioral change wheel, that these different drivers, which are related to motivation, opportunity, and ability, are also linked to different interventions. So that's really the steps we often follow when developing interventions. We try to explore, okay, what's the target group, what's the problem behavior, and can we get a bit of grip on the drivers in play and which type of interventions fit those consumer needs and can support behavior change. And the final example I included just to highlight, because it might also sound a bit like very conscious decision making, whereas what we also really know and always take into account is that behavior change and the thoughts and drivers of consumers are not all that conscious. And this picture is a really nice picture, which really highlights that although we always think the green brain is active and we weigh all those pros and cons, in essence, the purple brain is far more often active, and that's far more unconscious and affective part of our brain. So whereas we think that we are in the supermarket standing there and weighing all these decisions, in essence, our gut feeling, our reflexes, our heuristics, emotions are playing a big deal in making these decisions. So that's also important to take into account. So today I take you along in some of the examples of different interventions. I'm going to keep a bit of track of time. Just to highlight the type of interventions and try to inspire you with some ideas we had. So the first one, in essence, the first two are based more on the motivational route. And the first example of an experiment was rooted in this study we did, and we found that there are different groups of individuals. And three are quite straightforward. So there's an indifferent group. These people just do not care that much about animal welfare. There's a struggling group. They just don't know yet. A coping group, they already changed their behavior. So they are, for example, buying organic meat or less often meat, or they are becoming a flexitarian. And the interesting group is the strategic ignorant group. And in first instance, this group might look like an indifferent group because it looks as they ignore information and do not care that much about animal welfare. But what these people actually do is they do care about animal welfare, but they just think it's difficult and they ignore it at the moment because they do not know what to do with it. So they decide to close their eyes and ears and ignore these difficult issues and just enjoy their burger or barbecue, etc. And we thought that's an interesting group because their animal welfare values are already there, but they're not activated, they're just ignored. So can we activate them at the right moment? And that's what we try to do. So we went to a zoo in the Netherlands and we included there some posters. I circled them. So it's behind the counter and in the front of the store. And these posters are just asking, what do you think about animal welfare? And the idea behind it was, can we activate these values, which are already present, at the right moment of decision making? And going towards the design, we first had a control week, and then we had this question. And in the third week, we thought, okay, we want to assure it's not just about providing more attention to the burger. So we also asked a question about, or we included a poster about easy and the choice results in the same price. So it's nice and easy and the price is the same just to receive the same amount of attention. And the last week, we did both. So then we asked the question, and we put much more effort on the easiness and the price. And the results show that in the first week, so there was no material available, 4.7% of the individuals in the canteen of the zoo purchased a plant-based burger. I need to go, yeah. And when we just asked a question, do you consider animal welfare to be important? We could double the amount of plant-based burgers sold, which was really cool because we just asked that question. And we also saw that it's especially about that question. So when we highlighted the easiness and the price, it didn't differ significantly from the control condition. And also the combined promotion material shows the same amount of increase as the just asking the question. So what these results state, by just asking the question, you can change something, and it's especially about that aspect. And we thought that's kind of cool because it really shows that when you are talking about this group of individuals, which has these values somewhere, and you can activate it at the right moment of decision making, you can indeed assure that more individuals are going to purchase a plant-based burger. The second example, which is more about this motivational route, is this example. In this example, we tried to manipulate different messages on a packaging. So we included a burger in which there were all kinds of insects, and we included all kinds of different burgers. So some were chicken burgers in which the chicken ate insects as feed. Some were already quite processed in the insects that were included in the burgers, and some were included with quite fresh insects like these 100% buffalo worms. That's quite a lot of insects for consumers. And we changed the communication message. So I will translate this one. It was in Dutch, but I just translated. what we did is we just changed the messages on the packaging, and the one says feel good about yourself and choose the healthy alternative made from insects, and the other one says research shows, and the same information. And what we saw is that indeed, and that was also what we expected, that by highlighting this more emotional route, more people went to choose for the insect burgers. And the most interesting thing was that the more insects, so the more scary the product became for consumers, the more people, or the more important this effective route became. And this is very interesting because our default is to put a lot of attention to explaining everything to consumers and highlighting how good our research was, and highlighting all the added advantages. Whereas this research shows that this gut feeling and these emotional messages are very important, and we should also put a lot of emphasis in really highlighting the more emotional story of products.
Sorry, can you hear us from the room? Can you hear me? You have 2 more minutes before conclusion. Okay?
Okay. Then I will highlight one other example. I'm going to skip this one. This one is nice. So another example, we did an experiment in which we changed the default. So we had a restaurant, and we changed the default of the menu. So the first week there was a chicken wrap as the standard choice, and people could ask for a beans wrap. And in the second week we turned it around. So then the beans wrap was the standard choice, and people could ask for a chicken wrap. And in the third and the fourth week, we did the same thing, but then with seaweed. So and that's a bit more scary for consumers because seaweed is not something they consume very often. And the idea is people have the same option, they have the same choice, we just change the standard. And the results showed that in the first week, most of the consumers buy the chicken wrap, and not much consumers buy the beans wrap. Whereas in the second week, it turns around. Then most of the consumers are going to purchase the beans wrap. And in essence, in both weeks, they have the same choice. They have the same option. They just have to ask for it. And we see the same thing happening with seaweed. So this experiment shows that by setting a different standard, by setting the norm, and that's what we refer to as the default, people are really following that. And although you really think that you are making very conscious decisions in the restaurant, people are really influenced by the way a menu card is positioned and framed. And this example of a default really shows that. The other example I wanted to highlight, but I'm only going to highlight the results, is that we mixed the shelves. So we mixed meat and plant-based alternatives are now separate shelves, and we mixed it together. And the results indeed show that we could assure that more people are going to buy plant-based products in that way. But there were some conditions we should keep attention to. And I'm not going to detail into that one. But it's an interesting example because it highlights that if you make people, if you let them more consciously decide what option they should aim for that evening, am I going to eat an animal-based or a plant-based burger? And it's like on the moment of decision making, they are prompted to think about this decision, you can shift the decision making. And I'm going to skip those ones because you said 2 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up. So what I aim to show today is that interventions can support plant-based choices, and that consumer behavior is not always that rational. Though it can be understood, and it can be, and this knowledge can be used to support more sustainable choices. And the examples I included is that when you can trigger values and motivations at the right moment of decision making, you can activate more sustainable choices. If you can activate positive emotions, you can support more sustainable choices. Setting a standard, changing the default can be important, and to highlight in the end, it can also be really relevant to combine interventions. So these interventions seem to focus on one aspect or one driver, but sometimes more is needed to change support consumer behavior. So combining these interventions can also be important towards the desired choices of consumers. So that was it. Thank you very much.